Simone Weil, Attention, Affliction, and the Gravity of Grace. In this video, we'll break down one of the most fascinating philosophers of her time. She was one of the biggest advocates for worker rights, while also being a committed Marxist. She looked directly at suffering, at labor, at the weight of existence itself, and found there not abstractions, but lived truth. What makes Weil so remarkable is not just that she addressed ancient philosophical problems, but that she transformed philosophy into something urgent, embodied, and inseparable from how we actually live. She discovered that attention, the simple, profound act of truly seeing, is the fundamental moral and spiritual capacity that makes us human. This insight launched what might be called a phenomenological revolution in ethics and spirituality. But Weil did far more than revolutionize philosophical method. She created an entirely new understanding of how suffering relates to truth, how labor reveals human dignity, and how spiritual awakening occurs through decreation of the self. She developed a radical theory of attention that bridged mystical experience and political action. She outlined a vision of rootedness and human needs that continues to influence social philosophy today. Most importantly, Weil showed us what it means to be human in the most concrete sense. We are beings who bear gravity, the downward pull of necessity, power, and egoism. But we are also capable of grace, the upward movement toward truth, justice, and love. This tension between gravity and grace defines the human condition and gives us both crushing vulnerability and transcendent possibility. The journey through Weil's thought is challenging but transformative. Her ideas demand not just intellectual understanding, but personal transformation. Those who engage seriously with her work discover not abstract philosophy, but urgent wisdom for confronting the realities of suffering, work, and spiritual longing. Every concept we will explore connects to fundamental questions about how you should look, act, and relate to affliction and beauty in the world. This comprehensive exploration will take you through every major aspect of Weil's philosophical and spiritual vision. We will see how her ideas emerged from her experience of physical labor, political struggle, and mystical encounter. We will understand why she remains one of the most compelling and challenging voices in modern thought. Most importantly, we will see why Weil's insights speak with special urgency to our contemporary moment of crisis and transformation. Part 1. The Making of a Revolutionary Spirit. Simone Weil was born on February 3, 1909 in Paris, to a prosperous assimilated Jewish family. Her father was a physician, her mother a cultured woman who created an intellectually vibrant home. From the beginning, Simone's life was marked by contrast, privilege and solidarity with suffering, brilliant intellect and physical fragility, Jewish heritage and Christian mysticism. These tensions would define her entire philosophical project. The Weil family belonged to that generation of European Jews who embraced secular culture and Republican values while never fully escaping their marginal status. Simone grew up in a France still scarred by the Dreyfus Affair, where Jewish identity remained fraught with political significance. Yet her parents provided their children with education, culture, and the assumption of intellectual equality. Simone's older brother André would become one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, a fact that would profoundly affect her own intellectual development. The Paris of Weil's youth was the capital of European intellectual life, still recovering from the Great War that had shattered a generation. The 1920s brought both cultural experimentation and social unrest, as workers' movements challenged industrial capitalism and colonial empire. This atmosphere of crisis and possibility shaped Weil's emerging consciousness. From adolescence, she combined academic brilliance with passionate social concern, already demonstrating the refusal to separate thought from action that would characterize her entire life. At 14, Simone experienced what she later described as the most significant crisis of her youth. Comparing herself to her brother's mathematical genius, she despaired of her own intellectual gifts and contemplated suicide. This adolescent crisis revealed both her intense perfectionism and her capacity for profound self-doubt. But it also led to a crucial insight: that desire for truth, rather than possession of genius, constitutes the essential human vocation. This realization would become foundational to her philosophy of attention and spiritual apprenticeship. Weil excelled at the prestigious Lycée Henri IV, where she studied under the philosopher Émile Chartier, known as Alain. This teacher profoundly influenced her intellectual formation, introducing her to rigorous methods of textual analysis and emphasizing the importance of judging ideas by their concrete consequences rather than abstract principles. Alain taught that philosophy should emerge from careful attention to particular phenomena rather than from grand theoretical systems. This phenomenological approach became central to Weil's own method. Under Alain's guidance, Weil developed her lifelong conviction that philosophy must address real human problems rather than merely academic puzzles. She learned to distrust abstraction and to test ideas against lived experience. She absorbed the radical Republican tradition that emphasized human dignity, equality, and the obligation of intellectuals to serve rather than dominate. These lessons prepared her for the distinctive path her own thinking would take, always grounded in concrete experience, always testing ideas against the realities of suffering and labor. In 1928, at age 19, Weil entered the École Normale Supérieure, the elite institution that trained France's intellectual leaders. She was one of only a handful of women admitted, and her presence challenged the masculine culture of the institution. Fellow students nicknamed her the categorical imperative in skirts and the Red Virgin, recognizing both her moral intensity and her political radicalism. She dressed simply, often in men's clothing, rejecting conventional femininity and bourgeois respectability. During these years, Weil immersed herself in classical philosophy, particularly Plato, whose writings about beauty, justice, and the good would permanently shape her thinking. She also engaged deeply with Marx, whose analysis of alienated labor resonated with her own observations of industrial society. But she was never an orthodox Marxist, always testing communist ideology against her own experience and rejecting its determinism, its atheism, and its justification of violence. This critical engagement with Marxism would lead to some of her most original political philosophy. Weil's philosophical formation also included serious engagement with mathematics and natural science, influenced by her brother's work and her own conviction that scientific thinking exemplified the discipline and rigor required for genuine understanding. She studied geometry with particular attention, seeing in it a model of how thought can achieve necessity and universality. This scientific dimension of her education would inform her later writings on labor, technology, and the relationship between necessity and freedom. In 1931, Weil completed her aggregation in philosophy with a thesis on science and perception in Descartes, and began teaching philosophy at various lycées. But she could not remain a conventional academic. She participated in workers' demonstrations, supported strike actions, and taught evening courses for labourers. She gave much of her salary to unemployed workers and political causes. She wrote for radical journals, analysing the conditions of industrial labour and the failures of revolutionary politics. This combination of teaching, activism, and journalism became her characteristic mode of intellectual life. The years 1934-1935 marked a turning point. Despite fragile health and chronic headaches, Weil took leave from teaching to work in factories, first at Alstom Electrical Works, then at Renault. She wanted to experience directly the conditions of industrial labour that she had analysed theoretically. This year of factory work transformed her philosophy fundamentally. she discovered that physical labor under industrial conditions created a form of suffering, what she would call affliction, that threatened the very capacity for thought and human dignity. This experience would become the foundation for her mature philosophy. The factory year also brought spiritual crisis and transformation. The mechanical repetition, the physical exhaustion, the reduction of workers to interchangeable parts. All this crushed something essential in her spirit. She discovered that affliction does not ennoble or strengthen, but degrades and destroys. Yet she also discovered that attention, the capacity to be fully present despite suffering, represents the fundamental human dignity that affliction threatens. This dialectic of affliction and attention would become central to all her later work. Part 2. The Philosophy of Attention. Attention stands at the absolute center of Weil's philosophical vision, connecting her ethics, her epistemology, her politics, and her spirituality. Unlike traditional philosophers who emphasized will, reason, or feeling as the fundamental human capacity, Weil insisted that attention, the ability to suspend our projections and truly see what lies before us, constitutes the essential moral and intellectual virtue. This seemingly simple concept conceals revolutionary implications for how we understand knowledge, goodness, and spiritual transformation. Weil distinguished sharply between attention and mere mental effort or concentration. Attention is not forcing the mind to focus through willpower, but rather clearing away the ego's interference so that reality can be seen as it actually is. True attention requires what she called decreation, the progressive dismantling of the false self that stands between us and truth. This makes attention simultaneously the easiest and most difficult thing in the world. Easy because it requires only stopping our habitual distortions. Difficult because that stopping demands the dissolution of everything we mistake for ourselves. The development of attention requires what Weil called school exercises or academic work properly understood. Mathematics, classical languages, and rigorous textual analysis serve not primarily to convey information, but to train the faculty of attention itself. When a student struggles with a difficult geometry proof, the real benefit lies not in mastering that particular proof, but in developing the capacity to sustain attention without forcing, to wait patiently for understanding, rather than imposing premature solutions. This makes authentic education fundamentally spiritual training. School exercises develop attention because they present problems that cannot be solved through force of will or clever manipulation, but only through patient waiting for understanding to emerge. A difficult Latin translation or a complex mathematical problem resists our impatient ego and forces us to submit to the discipline of the subject matter itself. This submission to necessity, accepting that reality has its own structure that we must respect rather than dominate, prepares us for moral and spiritual understanding that also requires surrendering ego to truth. The connection between intellectual and moral attention reveals itself most clearly in what Weil called the implicit love of God in academic work. When we struggle with a difficult problem in complete honesty, refusing to pretend understanding we lack, accepting intellectual humility, desiring truth more than success, we perform an act of love. We orient ourselves toward a good beyond ourselves, accepting that we do not possess or control it. This same movement characterizes moral attention to other people and spiritual attention to divine reality. Weil's most famous ethical insight emerges directly from her theory of attention. The reality of other people can only be grasped through attention that suspends the ego's imposition of its own categories and needs. Normally, we do not see other people as real centers of experience and value, but only as objects in relation to our own projects. A servant appears as someone to command, a rival as an obstacle to overcome, even a friend as a source of pleasure. Authentic moral vision requires the difficult discipline of seeing another person as just as real as oneself, equally a center of suffering and desire, equally deserving of existence. This ethical attention becomes most difficult and most necessary when confronting affliction. The afflicted person, crushed by suffering, degraded, made apparently contemptible, challenges our capacity for moral vision more radically than any other phenomenon. Everything in us recoils from genuine encounters with affliction. We instinctively protect ourselves by looking away, by judging the afflicted as somehow responsible for their condition, by reducing them to abstract categories. Maintaining attention in the presence of affliction, truly seeing the afflicted person as real, represents the supreme ethical achievement. Weil illustrated ethical attention through the parable of the Good Samaritan, which she interpreted as fundamentally about vision. The priest and Levite do not see the wounded man. He simply does not register as a real presence making demands on them. The Samaritan sees. The wounded man is fully real to him, as real as himself. This seeing, not moral principle, not calculation of duty, but simple, direct perception of another's reality, generates compassionate action necessarily. Attention precedes and enables all authentic moral responses. The discipline of attention also transforms how we understand justice. Justice is not primarily about correct distribution of goods or proper application of rules, though these matter. More fundamentally, justice is attention to what is due to each being by virtue of what they are. We commit injustice not primarily through malice but through inattention, failing to see workers as fully human, failing to register the suffering of distant strangers, failing to recognize the rights that inhere in beings we have reduced to categories or abstractions. Contemporary education, in Weil's analysis, fails precisely because it abandons the training of attention in favor of mere information transfer or professional preparation. When education becomes purely instrumental, designed to produce efficient workers or successful competitors, it destroys rather than develops the capacity for attention. Students learn to manipulate concepts for advantage rather than to surrender to truth, to perform rather than to understand. This corruption of education represents spiritual catastrophe because it prevents the formation of souls capable of genuine moral and intellectual vision. The relationship between attention and prayer reveals the spiritual depth of Weil's concept. Prayer is not primarily petition or praise, but concentrated attention turned toward divine reality. The prayer, "Thy will be done," expresses perfect attention, complete suspension of the ego's demands, total openness to reality as it is. This makes prayer the paradigmatic form of attention, the practice that reveals and develops the fundamental human capacity for seeing beyond the self. Religious practices at their best serve to train attention. At their worst, they become substitutes for genuine attention, empty rituals that protect rather than dissolve the ego. Weil's theory of attention also explains why beauty plays such a crucial role in human life. Beautiful things, whether natural phenomena like stars and flowers or human creations like poetry and music, command attention without force. They draw us out of ourselves not through moral obligation or intellectual necessity, but through their own radiance. This makes beauty a kind of grace, a gift that enables us to practice attention without the painful effort required by less immediately attractive objects. Beauty trains the soul for harder tasks of attention to suffering and to God. The universality of Weil's concept of attention makes it applicable across all domains of human life, while avoiding the abstraction she deplored in traditional philosophy. Whether we are solving a mathematical problem, responding to a suffering person, appreciating a poem, or praying, we exercise the same fundamental capacity, the ability to suspend our ego's distortions and see what is actually there. This unified conception of human excellence, as attention rather than as divided faculties of will, intellect, and feeling, gives Weil's philosophy its remarkable coherence and power. Part 3. Affliction and the experience of necessity. Weil's concept of affliction, malheur, represents one of her most original and challenging contributions to philosophy. Affliction is not ordinary suffering or misfortune, but a specific condition where physical pain, social degradation, and psychological despair combine to crush the soul and threaten the very capacity to remain human. Understanding affliction requires attention to what most philosophy avoids: the brute reality of overwhelming suffering that destroys rather than ennobles, that degrades rather than purifies. This unflinching look at human vulnerability marks Weil's thought as uniquely honest and urgent. The phenomenon of affliction crystallized for Weil during her year of factory work, but she recognized it throughout history in slavery, in extreme poverty, in brutal imprisonment, and in the experience of conquered peoples. Affliction attacks simultaneously in 3 dimensions: physical pain or exhaustion that overwhelms consciousness, social contempt that strips away dignity and marks one as inferior, and spiritual despair that makes existence itself seem meaningless. This triple assault explains why affliction differs fundamentally from suffering that touches only one dimension of existence. What makes affliction so destructive is that it tends to produce effects that justify the contempt with which the afflicted are regarded. Extreme suffering degrades. It makes people servile, dishonest, grasping, and incapable of generosity. The afflicted often internalize their degradation, coming to believe they deserve their condition, accepting the judgment that they are worth less than others. This vicious circle, affliction causing degradation that justifies affliction, reveals something terrifying about human existence. We are fragile beings whose very humanity can be destroyed by circumstances. Weil insisted controversially that only those who have experienced or directly witnessed affliction can truly understand it. The comfortable, no matter how imaginative or compassionate, cannot grasp affliction because imagination itself is a form of protection. We imagine suffering from a position of safety, as something happening to a hypothetical other. But affliction is precisely the condition where one ceases to be an agent who might suffer and becomes instead a thing that is destroyed. This unbridgeable gap between affliction and its conceptual understanding challenges traditional philosophy's assumption that everything can be grasped through thought. The experience of affliction reveals what Weil called necessity, the blind mechanical force that crushes human beings without regard for justice, merit, or meaning. Necessity operates in the physical world through gravity, in the social world through force and oppression, in the psychological world through compulsion and habit. Understanding necessity is crucial for human wisdom, yet necessity by definition excludes understanding. It simply is, brute fact, mechanical causation, the weight that crushes everything in its path. Ancient Greek tragedy, particularly as exemplified in Homer and Sophocles, achieved unique insight into necessity according to Weil. The Iliad depicts force, the capacity to turn human beings into things, with unflinching clarity. Warriors on both sides are shown as equally human, equally beloved, equally transformed into corpses by the blind mechanism of violence. This tragic vision recognizes necessity without justifying it, sees suffering without explaining it away, confronts human vulnerability without false consolation. Modern culture, by contrast, systematically avoids this truth through melodrama, sentimentality, and ideologies that promise progress or redemption. The relationship between affliction and sin presents one of Weil's most paradoxical and difficult claims. She argued that affliction compels sin. Those who are crushed by overwhelming circumstances cannot maintain moral agency. They lie, steal, betray, and degrade themselves through necessity rather than free choice. Yet she also insisted that all sin, even that committed under extreme duress, remains sin, a falling away from good that marks the soul. This apparent contradiction resolves only through recognizing that affliction reveals the limits of human freedom while not eliminating moral reality. We remain responsible even when we cannot respond adequately. Weil's analysis of affliction led her to a distinctive theodicy, an attempt to reconcile suffering with divine goodness. She rejected traditional theodicies that explain or justify suffering by showing its hidden purpose or beneficial effects. Such approaches, she argued, insult those who suffer by treating their anguish as instrumentally valuable. Instead, Weil insisted that affliction has no justification or purpose. It exists simply because creation involves the withdrawal of God to make space for necessity. The cross reveals not that suffering has meaning, but that God shares in meaningless suffering. This understanding of affliction shapes Weil's political philosophy fundamentally. Political systems that create or permit affliction commit absolute evil, regardless of their theoretical justifications or long-term intentions. Revolutionary movements that claim to fight oppression while creating new forms of affliction betray their own stated purposes. The test of any social order must be whether it protects the vulnerable from falling into affliction, whether it preserves the conditions necessary for human beings to maintain dignity, attention, and the capacity for moral life. The experience of affliction also reveals the truth about human identity and ego. Under extreme pressure, the self we thought we were dissolves. The stable personality, the cherished self-image, the sense of being someone, all this proves to be constructed and fragile, easily destroyed by circumstances. This forced decreation through affliction differs crucially from spiritual decreation, chosen through grace. Affliction crushes the soul, grace empties it voluntarily. Yet both reveal the same truth. The self we defend so fiercely has no substantial reality. Contemporary society, in Weil's analysis, systematically produces affliction through industrial labor, economic insecurity, and social uprooting, while simultaneously denying its existence through consoling ideologies. We are told that suffering builds character, that the poor lack virtue, that success proves merit. These lies protect the comfortable from recognizing affliction while making the afflicted bear not just suffering, but also the judgment that they are responsible for their condition. This double cruelty, affliction plus denial, characterizes modern injustice. Weil's concept of affliction challenges contemporary philosophy in fundamental ways. Most ethical theory assumes moral agents with basic capacities for deliberation and choice. But affliction destroys these capacities. Most political philosophy aims at justice, understood as proper distribution or recognition. But affliction precedes and exceeds these categories, creating conditions where ordinary notions of justice become meaningless. Philosophy that has not confronted affliction remains abstract, dealing with problems of the comfortable while ignoring the reality that defines existence for vast numbers of human beings. The only adequate response to affliction, Weil argued, is a form of attention so complete, so selfless, that it can look at the destroyed soul without flinching and still recognize it as fully real, fully deserving of existence. This attention cannot be commanded or produced through will. It requires grace, a supernatural capacity for seeing that transcends natural human limits. Yet the possibility of such attention remains the only thing that makes human existence more than mere natural process, the only thing that answers affliction with something other than more affliction. Part 4. Labour, Oppression, and Human Dignity. Weil's philosophy of labour emerged directly from her factory experience and represents one of her most original contributions to social thought. Unlike Marx, who emphasized alienation or traditional philosophy, which ignored manual labour entirely, Weil focused on how labour shapes consciousness and either enables or destroys the capacity for attention and thought. Work, properly understood, should be humanity's fundamental relationship with material necessity. But modern industrial labour has become a form of oppression that crushes the soul while claiming to create freedom and prosperity. The fundamental problem with industrial labour, as Weil experienced it, is that workers have been reduced to interchangeable parts in a mechanism they neither understand nor control. The fragmentation of tasks means that no individual worker grasps the whole process or sees the final product of collective effort. The pace is determined by machines rather than human rhythm. The repetition is numbing rather than meditative. Most fundamentally, workers have no meaningful choice about what they do, how they do it, or why. They have been transformed from subjects who act to objects that are acted upon. This reduction of workers to things constitutes not just economic injustice, but spiritual catastrophe. Human dignity depends on being a conscious agent who acts on the world with understanding. When labour becomes a mere mechanical response to external commands, consciousness itself atrophies. The worker stops thinking, stops attending, stops being fully human. Well observed that factory workers often displayed a kind of servility and diminished humanity that was not their fault, but the necessary result of conditions that destroyed the capacity for independent thought and moral agency. Traditional analyses of economic oppression, whether liberal or Marxist, missed this crucial dimension, according to Weil. They focused on material conditions, wages, hours, ownership of means of production, while ignoring the spiritual destruction caused by the organization of work itself. A well-paid worker in comfortable conditions remains oppressed if their labor is meaningless, fragmented repetition without understanding or choice. Conversely, even difficult physical labor can preserve dignity if the worker understands and controls the process, if skill matters, if thought guides action. Weil proposed that truly human labor must satisfy several conditions. First, it must involve understanding of the whole process, not just mechanical execution of fragmented tasks. A craftsperson who sees raw materials transformed through their own skilled action into a finished product exemplifies this understanding. Second, labor must allow for thought and judgment, not just rote repetition. The worker must make decisions, solve problems, adapt means to ends. Third, labor must connect effort to perceptible results so that the worker can see the effects of their action on the world. The ideal of craftsmanship served Weil as the model for dignified labor, though she recognized that modern technology makes universal return to traditional crafts impossible. What matters is preserving the essential features of craftwork: understanding, skill, judgment, and perceptible connection between effort and result. This might mean reorganizing factories to give workers more complete tasks, involving them in design and planning, teaching them the technical principles underlying production processes. The goal is not efficiency, but preservation of human consciousness through meaningful work. Weil's critique extended to modern management and scientific organization of labor. Frederick Taylor's time-motion studies in the assembly line represent the systematic elimination of thought from work. By breaking complex tasks into simple motions, by timing and standardizing every gesture, by reducing workers to executors of predetermined procedures, scientific management achieved greater efficiency by destroying human dignity. The claim that this benefits workers through higher wages misses the point. Material comfort cannot compensate for spiritual destruction. The political implications of Weil's labor analysis were radical. She argued that capitalism and Soviet-style communism both organized work in ways that oppressed workers, despite their theoretical differences about ownership. What mattered was not who owned the factories, but how labor itself was organized. Any system, capitalist, communist, or some other arrangement, would be oppressive if it reduced workers to things, fragmented their understanding, and eliminated meaningful choice. True liberation required transforming the nature of work, not just changing ownership. Weil's vision of dignified labor connected to her broader philosophy of attention and spiritual development. Meaningful work trains attention by requiring constant engagement with material necessity. The craftsperson must attend carefully to materials, tools, and procedures. Small errors have visible consequences. One cannot merely go through motions, but must remain present and alert. This discipline of attention in work parallels and supports the attention required for moral and spiritual life. Mindless labor, by contrast, trains inattention and servility. The relationship between labor and nature reveals another dimension of Weil's analysis. Human beings must work because we face material necessity. We require food, shelter, and other goods that nature does not provide spontaneously. This necessity could be experienced as mere constraint or as meaningful participation in cosmic order. When labor involves intelligent response to natural patterns, planting in the proper season, working wood with its grain, understanding chemical processes, it becomes a form of knowledge and even communion with creation. Industrial labor, by imposing mechanical rhythms alien to both human and natural patterns, severs this connection. Contemporary economic systems, in Weil's view, have become increasingly divorced from any concern for human dignity or spiritual development. The logic of efficiency, competition, and unlimited growth dominates all other considerations. Workers are human resources to be exploited until exhausted, then discarded. Consumers are manipulated through advertising that cultivates artificial needs, while ignoring genuine human requirements. The entire economy operates as a blind mechanism, serving no intelligible human purpose, generating wealth that fails to produce well-being or meaning. Weil proposed that economics should be subordinated to a higher principle, the cultivation of human beings capable of attention, thought, and spiritual life. This requires organizing labor to preserve and develop consciousness rather than destroy it. It means rejecting efficiency as the supreme value and accepting material limitations in exchange for meaningful work. It demands that technology serve human purposes rather than humans serving technological imperatives. Most fundamentally, it requires recognizing that economic life exists for the sake of human flourishing, not the reverse. The connection between labor and politics became clear to Weil through her factory experience and her observation of workers' movements. Revolutionary movements repeatedly failed because they focused on seizing power or changing ownership while leaving intact the organization of labor that oppressed workers. Even successful revolutions like the Soviet Union reproduced oppression because they maintained and even intensified the industrial methods that reduced workers to things. True social transformation required much more radical changes in how work itself was conceived and organized. Weil's labor philosophy challenges both traditional political philosophy and contemporary economic thinking. Traditional philosophy ignored labor entirely, treating productive activity as beneath philosophical consideration. Contemporary economics treats labor as merely one factor of production, important only for its contribution to output and growth. Weil insisted that labor constitutes humanity's fundamental relationship with existence, and that how we organize work shapes whether human beings can develop their essential capacities or are reduced to less than human status. Part 5. Rootedness and the Needs of the Soul. In her final major work, The Need for Roots, written during World War II, Weil developed a comprehensive theory of human needs and social obligations that synthesizes her political philosophy with her spiritual vision. She argued that human beings have needs of the soul just as real and just as imperative as physical needs for food and shelter. Meeting these spiritual needs is the fundamental obligation of any legitimate social order. Failure to recognize and satisfy these needs produces the uprootedness and spiritual emptiness that characterize modern society and make possible totalitarian movements. Weil identified rootedness as the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. Rootedness means participation in a community that preserves a living connection to the past, that provides meaningful social roles, and that offers a framework of meaning extending beyond individual existence. Modern society systematically destroys rootedness through constant change, geographic mobility, economic disruption, and the reduction of community to mere aggregate of individuals pursuing private interests. This uprootedness creates a terrible void that nothing can fill except totalitarian movements offering false community through violence and mass identity. The catalogue of spiritual needs while developed includes order, liberty, obedience, responsibility, equality, hierarchy, honor, punishment, freedom of opinion, security, risk, private property, collective property, and truth. Each need must be satisfied in balance with others. Exaggeration of any single need produces pathology. Modern ideologies typically absolutize one or two needs while ignoring others, producing distorted visions of human flourishing that inevitably disappoint or oppress. A truly human social order must recognize the full complexity of human nature and create institutions that address all essential needs. Order and liberty present the first crucial pair of complementary needs. Human beings require stable patterns and reliable expectations, order that makes coherent life possible. But they also need space for choice, spontaneity, and self-direction. Liberty that preserves agency. Neither pure order nor pure liberty can satisfy human requirements. Traditional societies emphasized order sometimes, to the point of stifling oppression. Modern societies emphasize liberty sometimes to the point of chaotic anomie. Wisdom lies in recognizing that both needs are real and must be balanced. Obedience and responsibility constitute another essential pair. People need to obey legitimate authority that merits respect and provides guidance. But they also need to take responsibility for their own judgments and actions. Modern society corrupts both needs. It demands obedience to arbitrary power while denying individuals meaningful responsibility. Workers obey managers but bear no responsibility for what they produce. Citizens obey laws but participate minimally in governance. This combination of servility without responsibility degrades human dignity. Equality and hierarchy reflect the paradox that human beings are both equal in essential dignity and unequal in capacity, role, and merit. Everyone deserves equal respect as a human being. No one should be treated as inherently superior or inferior by nature. Yet human communities require differentiation of function, recognition of excellence, and authority structures. The challenge is creating hierarchies based on genuine merit and social function rather than arbitrary privilege, while maintaining fundamental equality of human worth across all distinctions of role or status. Honor, the sense of participating in a tradition and exemplifying standards that command respect, represents a need modern society particularly neglects. Mass production, constant innovation, and instrumental thinking destroy the conditions for genuine honor. When nothing endures, when skill is obsolete before it can be mastered, when every activity is judged solely by material results, honor becomes impossible. Yet human beings need to feel that what they do matters, that their work exemplifies standards worth upholding. that their existence has significance beyond mere biological survival. The need for punishment, paradoxically, reflects the need to be treated as a responsible, moral agent. When someone commits wrong and society responds with mere therapeutic intervention or ignores the offense, it denies the wrongdoer's reality as a moral person capable of choosing evil. Punishment, properly understood, recognizes the reality of moral agency and provides a path toward reintegration into community. Of course, punishment must be just and proportionate, aimed at restoration rather than revenge. But the need itself reveals that humans require recognition as moral beings, even, especially, when they act immorally. Freedom of opinion stands among the highest spiritual needs, because thought itself requires liberty. No authentic thinking occurs under compulsion. True intellectual life demands the ability to pursue questions wherever they lead, without fear of punishment. Yet Weil insisted that freedom of opinion does not include the right to propagate lies or to poison public discourse through deliberate misinformation. Truth has rights that error does not. This paradoxical position, defending intellectual freedom while insisting on truth's priority, reflects her conviction that liberty serves truth rather than being an end in itself. Security and risk form another necessary pair of complementary needs. Human beings require basic security, assured access to necessities, protection from arbitrary violence, stable social order. Without security, anxiety prevents the development of higher capacities. Yet humans also need risk, the possibility of danger, adventure, and achievement earned through overcoming difficulty. Pure security produces stagnation and boredom. Pure risk produces terror and chaos. A healthy society provides security in basic matters while preserving opportunities for meaningful risk in domains where individuals can choose their challenges. Property rights, according to Weil, reflect two distinct needs that should not be confused. Private property satisfies the need for a secure personal domain, a space where one exercises autonomous choice and maintains independence. Collective property satisfies the need to participate in goods that belong to the community as a whole. Common lands, shared traditions, public institutions. Modern capitalism exaggerates private property to the point of destroying community. Socialist systems exaggerate collective property to the point of eliminating personal autonomy. Both needs must be recognized and satisfied in balance. Truth stands as the supreme need, not because humans always desire truth, but because the soul cannot be healthy without it. Lies, even comfortable ones, poison spiritual life. Systematic falsehood, as in totalitarian propaganda, destroys the very possibility of thought and judgment. This makes truth the prerequisite for satisfying all other needs, since authentic human life requires accurate understanding of reality. Society's fundamental obligation is protecting the conditions where truth can be sought, spoken, and heard without fear or compulsion. Weil's analysis of uprootedness focused particularly on the destruction of working-class culture through industrialization. Traditional communities of workers and peasants possessed rich cultural traditions, craft knowledge, and patterns of mutual aid. Industrial capitalism destroyed these communities through mobility requirements, factory discipline, and the reduction of workers to interchangeable parts. Nothing replaced what was lost. Workers became atomized individuals without cultural inheritance or community support, vulnerable to manipulation by both commercial interests and totalitarian movements. The uprootedness of intellectuals presented a different but equally serious problem. Cut off from the life of labor and from traditional cultural forms, intellectual classes developed increasingly abstract and disconnected modes of thought. They created ideologies that bore little relation to lived experience, that promised impossible utopias while ignoring actual human needs. This intellectual uprootedness contributed to political catastrophes like fascism and Stalinism, which intellectuals often supported despite their obvious brutality, because abstract theory blinded them to concrete reality. Colonial conquest represents perhaps the most catastrophic form of imposed uprootedness. When European powers destroyed indigenous cultures, they did not simply exploit resources or establish political control. They severed entire peoples from their spiritual roots, from the traditions and meanings that made life coherent. This crime, cultural destruction, exceeds even the economic exploitation that typically preoccupies critics of colonialism. Material theft can be compensated. Spiritual uprootedness creates wounds that may never heal. We'll propose that post-war reconstruction must prioritize rerouting populations through cultural renewal, meaningful work, and restored communities. This requires not a nostalgic return to pre-industrial conditions, but creative adaptation of traditional wisdom to contemporary circumstances. It means preserving continuity with the past while allowing genuine evolution. It demands recognizing that material prosperity cannot substitute for spiritual sustenance, that efficiency cannot justify uprootedness, that progress means development of human capacities rather than mere increase in production or consumption. The contemporary relevance of Weil's analysis of rootedness is striking. Globalization, digital technology, and economic disruption continue to uproot populations while offering no genuine replacement for lost community and tradition. Mental health crises, political polarization, and susceptibility to extremist movements all suggest that modern society fails to meet fundamental spiritual needs. Weil's framework provides resources for diagnosing these pathologies and imagining alternatives that honor the full range of human requirements, rather than reducing everything to material satisfaction or individual choice. Part 6. Decreation and the Path to God. Weil's spiritual philosophy centers on the concept of decreation, the voluntary dissolution of the ego that opens space for divine presence. This concept distinguishes her mysticism from both traditional religious piety and secular humanism. Unlike ordinary religious practice that often reinforces ego through spiritual pride or merit-seeking, decreation requires renouncing even spiritual consolations and achievements. Unlike humanism that exalts human capacity and dignity, decreation recognizes that the self we cherish most must be surrendered for truth and God to enter. This paradoxical teaching, that we become most truly ourselves by ceasing to assert self, reflects Weil's deepest insight about human existence. Decreation differs fundamentally from destruction. Destruction eliminates being. Decreation transforms the mode of being from self-centered to God-centered. Creation brought finite beings into existence, separate from God. Decreation completes the creative act by enabling creatures voluntarily to return their being to God while remaining distinct existences. This movement is not annihilation of the person, but transformation from false, egoic selfhood to true, transparent existence that reflects divine reality without distortion. God creates us separate. We must decreate ourselves to become properly related to our source. The process of decreation begins with recognizing the illusory nature of the ego. What we call I is not a substantial reality but a construction, a habit, a gravitational pull towards self-concern that obscures truth. This self guards itself through constant judgment, comparison, and appropriation. It experiences everything in terms of what it wants, fears, or uses. Spiritual progress requires gradually loosening the ego's grip through practices that weaken self-attachment and open attention to reality beyond self-concern. Weil identified several key practices of decreation. Attention, as already discussed, trains us to see without imposing ego's categories. Obedience to necessity teaches us to accept limitations rather than demanding that reality conform to desire. Love, rightly understood, means regarding the beloved with attention that honors their independent reality rather than possessing them as objects for self-satisfaction. Physical labor, if approached rightly, disciplines the soul through submission to material constraints that resist willful manipulation. Each practice works against the gravitational pull of ego toward self-assertion. Prayer represents the supreme exercise in decreation because it explicitly orients consciousness toward God while suspending all self-concern. The prayer, "Thy will be done," perfectly expresses decreative movement, complete surrender of personal will, total acceptance of divine purpose, absolute openness to reality as God intends it, rather than as ego desires it. This prayer does not seek anything for the self, but simply aligns the soul with truth. When genuinely practiced, it gradually dissolves the barrier between self and God, enabling divine presence to fill the void where ego previously held sway. The relationship between grace and decreation presents a paradox central to Weil's spirituality. Decreation cannot be achieved through will or effort, because will itself is precisely what must be surrendered. Yet humans must do something. Spiritual passivity that waits for God to act without human cooperation misunderstands the nature of divine-human relationship. Weil's solution: we must desire, wait, and attend with complete intensity while remaining completely passive with respect to results. We prepare space for grace but cannot force its coming. Grace does the work of transformation, but only in souls that have created room for it through patient attention and decreation. Suffering plays a crucial role in decreation, though not in the sense that suffering itself purifies or merits grace. Rather, suffering, when accepted without rebellion or escape, can loosen ego's grip by revealing its constructed, contingent nature. In profound suffering, the self we thought we were dissolves. If we can maintain attention and consent during this dissolution, instead of desperately trying to reconstruct ego, suffering becomes an opportunity for grace. The cross represents the perfect example. God himself undergoes complete decreation, surrendering divine power and glory to share in creaturely limitation and death. Weil's interpretation of the Passion emphasizes not substitutionary atonement or payment for sin, but rather God's identification with afflicted humanity through voluntary acceptance of decreation. Christ on the cross experiences absolute abandonment, not just physical death, but spiritual desolation, the feeling that even God has withdrawn. This represents ultimate decreation, the complete emptying of self. Yet this emptying opens space for resurrection, for transformation, for the manifestation of life beyond death. The pattern applies to all spiritual life. Only through death of the false self can authentic life emerge. The concept of detachment clarifies decreation's nature and purpose. Detachment does not mean indifference or withdrawal from the world and relationships. It means loving and acting without attachment to results or possession, without making loved objects serve ego's needs. We can be passionately engaged with work, committed to people, involved in political struggle, while remaining detached in the spiritual sense, not grasping, not claiming ownership, not asserting ego through our activities. This detachment liberates energy for genuine love and action, while preventing the spiritual idolatry of making finite goods into ultimate concerns. Weil's mysticism incorporates what she called implicit love of God, found in three forms: love of neighbor, love of the beauty of the world, and love of religious practices. Each form enables loving God indirectly when explicit knowledge of God seems impossible, or when religious language has become corrupt. The atheist who loves truth passionately, the artist who attends to natural beauty with devotion, the political activist who serves afflicted people selflessly, each practices implicit love of God without necessarily recognizing it as such. This inclusive vision honors authentic spirituality wherever it appears while maintaining the primacy of divine reality. The beauty of the world serves as a kind of sacrament, a material manifestation of divine love that draws us toward God through sensory experience. Stars, flowers, the sea, music, poetry, all beautiful things share the character of commanding attention without force, of giving themselves freely without demanding anything in return. This generosity of beauty mirrors divine generosity. Attending to beauty trains us for attention to God. Yet beauty can also become an obstacle if we claim or possess it, rather than allowing it to direct us beyond itself toward its transcendent source. Weil's controversial claim that creation involves God's withdrawal rather than God's power reflects her deepest understanding of love and freedom. For God to create beings truly other than himself, God must limit divine presence, must create space where necessity operates and where creatures can exist independently. This divine kenosis, self-emptying, makes creation possible, but also makes possible all the suffering and evil that result from necessity and creaturely freedom. God's apparent absence from the world is not failure or indifference, but the necessary condition for creation's existence. Our experience of divine absence can become the deepest contact with divine reality when we understand it rightly. The problem of evil receives distinctive treatment in Weil's theology. She rejected theodicies that explain or justify evil by showing its hidden purpose. Evil has no purpose. It simply results from the necessary conditions of creation, the operation of mechanical necessity and creaturely freedom. God is not responsible for evil in the sense of willing or causing it, yet God accepts responsibility by creating a world where evil is possible and then sharing in creaturely suffering through the incarnation. This makes evil simultaneously inexplicable and redeemed. Inexplicable because it has no divine purpose, redeemed because God participates in it and transforms it through love. Weil's mystical experiences, which she documented in her spiritual autobiography, confirmed through direct encounter what her philosophical analysis had concluded. She experienced Christ's presence on 3 occasions without seeking or expecting such grace. These experiences convinced her of Christianity's truth while also raising difficult questions about her relationship to the institutional church. She was baptized shortly before her death, but had long resisted formal membership, concerned that institutional religion often obstructs rather than facilitates authentic spiritual life. The tension between institutional religion and genuine spirituality remained unresolved in Weil's thought and life. She recognized that religious communities preserve sacred texts, transmit practices, and maintain continuity with spiritual traditions. Yet she observed how easily religion becomes an idol, a substitute for genuine attention to God, a source of spiritual pride, a tool for social control. The ideal would be religious communities that genuinely serve decreation and attention, rather than reinforcing ego through religious performance or tribal identity. Whether such communities can exist remains an open question. Contemporary spirituality finds in Weil both challenge and inspiration. She challenges popular notions that spirituality should make us feel good, that authentic selfhood means self-expression and self-fulfillment, that love means supporting others in whatever they choose. Against these comfortable assumptions, she insists that truth requires surrendering ego, that love demands attention to reality beyond one's preferences, that spiritual life involves suffering that cannot be eliminated or explained away. Yet she also inspires through her absolute honesty, her refusal of false consolation, and her testimony that supernatural reality can be encountered by those who genuinely seek it. Part 7. Force, War, and the Iliad. Weil's most famous essay, The Iliad, or The Poem of Force, written as World War II began, represents one of the most profound reflections on violence in modern literature. She discovered in Homer's ancient epic a vision of war more truthful than anything in contemporary literature or political discourse. A vision that sees force as the ultimate reality that reduces human beings to things, victors and vanquished alike. This essay crystallizes themes running throughout her work: the operation of necessity, the fragility of humanity, the difficulty of maintaining moral vision in the face of overwhelming power. Force, in Weil's analysis, is not merely violence or coercion, but the capacity to turn human beings into things. The person who holds a sword over another's head possesses force. The one who submits becomes thing. But this transformation affects both parties, though differently. The victim loses agency, becoming mere matter that can be destroyed. The victor loses humanity through the intoxication of power, through the temptation to abuse dominance, through habituation to treating others as objects. Force thus corrupts and degrades everyone it touches, making genuine human relationship impossible. Homer's greatness lies in his equal treatment of Greek and Trojan suffering, his recognition that force operates mechanically without regard for justice or merit, his refusal to glorify victory or demonize defeat. The Iliad shows warriors in their full humanity, loving, fearing, thinking, hoping, then shows them reduced to corpses in an instant. This juxtaposition repeats throughout the epic, creating unbearable pathos. We see Hector playing with his infant son, then Hector's corpse dragged behind Achilles' chariot. We see Patroclus alive and beautiful, then Patroclus dead and his armor stripped away. The poem's power comes from its absolute honesty about force's effects. The transformation of human beings into things operates through several mechanisms Weil identified. Physical force literally destroys bodies, turning living consciousness into dead matter. Social force reduces people to instruments or obstacles in others' projects, stripping away their reality as independent centers of experience. Psychological force compels actions through threat or habituated submission, eliminating genuine choice. Economic force reduces workers to factors of production valued only for output. Each form of force operates the same essential transformation, from subject to object, from person to thing. Victory in war brings special danger because it produces the illusion of exemption from necessity. The victor forgets that force operates mechanically, that today's winner becomes tomorrow's loser, that the same necessity that crushes enemies will eventually crush oneself. This forgetfulness, what the Greeks called hubris, leads victors to abuse their power, to commit atrocities, to treat defeated enemies as less than human. But necessity avenges all such presumption. The victor who forgets force's impersonal nature becomes its next victim, experiencing in turn the reduction to the thinghood they inflicted on others. Weil observed that the Iliad's greatness became incomprehensible to later Greek culture and to Rome, both of which preferred literature that glorified their own peoples and justified their conquests. Only brief moments in European literature, in fragments of Greek tragedy, in certain medieval epics in Shakespeare, recovered Homer's impartial vision of force. Most literature, like most political discourse, functions as propaganda, telling stories that portray one's own side as righteous and one's enemies as deserving destruction. Such literature lies about force's nature and enables the perpetuation of violence through false justification. The connection between force and idolatry reveals itself in how nations at war deify their own cause while demonizing the enemy. Each side claims God's favor, righteousness, civilization, or historical necessity as justification for violence. These false gods, nation, race, ideology, historical progress, command absolute devotion and justify any atrocity committed in their names. War reveals humanity's persistent tendency toward idolatry, toward making finite goods or powers into ultimate concerns that displace genuine divine reality and legitimate moral constraints. Christianity, despite its gospel of love, has repeatedly blessed and legitimated force while observed with anguish. The Church's alliance with the Empire, the Crusades, religious wars, colonial conquest blessed by missionaries, all represent betrayals of Christ's teaching and example. Christianity's distinctive insight should be that the cross reveals divine solidarity with victims of force and divine rejection of violence as means to righteousness. But historical Christianity more often imitated Rome than Jesus, seeking power rather than serving afflicted persons, justifying force rather than refusing it. Pacifism, in Weil's view, while morally superior to enthusiasm for war, can itself become a form of self-righteousness that refuses to confront the genuine dilemmas of force. Sometimes violence may be the lesser evil, when the only alternatives involve greater violence or submission to tyranny. What matters is maintaining clarity about force's nature, that it always reduces persons to things, that it always corrupts those who use it, that it never achieves genuine good even when it prevents greater evil. We can choose force as lesser evil while recognizing that we become complicit in evil through that choice. The tragedy of the French collapse in 1940 forced Weil to confront her own relationship to force and political obligation. She had been pacifist, opposing French military preparation and colonial war. But facing Nazi occupation, she recognized that force must sometimes be resisted with force, that allowing totalitarian victory would be a moral catastrophe, greater than the evil of violent resistance. Yet she insisted that even justified violence corrupts, and that those who fight must maintain awareness of their own participation in evil, rather than claiming righteousness. Weil's analysis of force illuminates contemporary conflicts with painful clarity. Modern warfare, with its aerial bombardment, its displacement of civilian populations, its industrial production of death, represents force operating with unprecedented power to transform humans into things. Terrorism, despite its claims to justice, operates through pure force, reducing victims to instruments for creating terror. Economic systems that create massive inequality and affliction deploy force as effectively as military conquest, though less visibly. Each exemplifies the force's essential character, the reduction of persons to things. The possibility of resisting force without becoming corrupted by it requires spiritual resources that, while acknowledged as rare and fragile, one must maintain attention to the humanity of enemies while fighting them, must refuse the intoxication of power while exercising it, must act from necessity rather than hatred or ambition. This near impossible balance demands constant vigilance against the force's corrupting influence. Religious traditions, at their best, preserve teachings that might enable such resistance. But religious institutions more often legitimize force through just war theories, holy war doctrines, and alliance with political power. The essay on the Iliad remains Weil's most widely read work because it speaks to permanent human problems with wisdom that historical distance does not diminish. As long as humans make war, dominate each other, and employ force to achieve their purposes, Weil's analysis of how force reduces persons to things will remain urgently relevant. Her refusal of both militant nationalism and naive pacifism, her equal attention to all victims of force, her recognition that force corrupts everyone. It touches these insights provide rare resources for thinking honestly about violence in human life. Part 8. Greece, Rome, and the Transformation of Culture. Weil's historical and cultural analysis, though less systematically developed than other aspects of her thought, reveals patterns that illuminate both past and present. She identified ancient Greece and the Gospel as the two main sources of Western spiritual insight, while seeing Rome as the great catastrophe that corrupted and distorted these sources. Understanding this interpretation provides crucial context for her diagnosis of modernity and her vision of cultural renewal. For Weil, history is not mere sequence of events, but a record of spiritual truths, embodied or betrayed by civilizations. Ancient Greece achieved unique insight into necessity, beauty, and the proper relationship between human beings and the world, according to Weil. Greek geometry discovered eternal truths through patient attention to spatial relationships. Greek tragedy confronted suffering without false consolation or religious justification. Greek philosophy pursued truth without regard for utility or power. Above all, Greek civilization at its height maintained balance between recognizing necessity's constraint and affirming human dignity, between accepting fate and exercising freedom. The pre-Socratic philosophers particularly attracted Weil's attention for their insights into cosmic order and human wisdom. Pythagoras understood the mathematical structure underlying material reality. Heraclitus recognized logos, rational principle, operating throughout change. Anaximander conceived cosmic justice as balance and proportion. These thinkers saw the universe as ordered intelligibly, subject to principles accessible through thought, yet ultimately mysterious and worthy of reverent attention. This worldview combined rational inquiry with spiritual humility in ways later philosophy often lost. Greek tragedy, especially Aeschylus and Sophocles, provided Weil with models for confronting affliction honestly. Prometheus's Bound shows suffering without justification, punishment without crime, endurance without hope of release, yet maintains heroic dignity through refusal of submission to mere force. The Oresteia traces the transformation of vengeance into justice through establishment of legal institutions, showing how human wisdom can partially civilize force. Antigone presents irresoluble conflict between legitimate claims, showing that moral life sometimes offers no good choice, but only tragic necessity. Yet Greek civilization also contains seeds of its own corruption, particularly in the transition from early philosophy to Platonic and Aristotelian systems that claimed comprehensive understanding. When philosophy became systematic rather than aphoristic, when it claimed to explain rather than merely observe, when it sought power through knowledge rather than wisdom through attention, Greek thought began losing its spiritual depth. The sophists who reduced truth to persuasion and philosophy to technique represented one form of corruption. Platonism, that claimed knowledge of eternal forms beyond this world, represented another. Rome represented for Weil absolute spiritual catastrophe, though she acknowledged Roman genius for law and administration. Rome's fundamental orientation was toward power, conquering neighbors, expanding territory, dominating other peoples. Roman religion was contractual, bargaining with gods for favors. Roman virtue emphasized strength, discipline, and patriotic sacrifice, but Roman vice was unlimited cruelty to conquered peoples and glorification of force itself. Most destructive, Rome created a model of imperial power that later civilizations imitated, spreading Rome's spiritual corruption across centuries and continents. The Roman absorption of Christianity transformed a religion of love into an ideology of power in Weil's controversial analysis. Constantine's conversion, rather than representing Christianity's triumph, marked its betrayal. The Church became allied with the empire, blessing armies, justifying conquest, persecuting heretics with force it claimed Christ had authorized. Instead of Christianity transforming Rome through the gospel of love and self-renunciation, Rome transformed Christianity into a religion compatible with domination and violence. This catastrophe's effects persist in Christian complicity with unjust power structures throughout history. Medieval Christianity preserved certain Greek and gospel insights despite Roman corruption, particularly in mystical traditions that emphasized renunciation, contemplation, and divine love. Weil particularly valued traditions of courtly love, Cathar spirituality, and Romanesque architecture that expressed something irreducible to Roman categories. These represented authentic spiritual achievement, even when heretical from an official church perspective. Their persecution by ecclesial authority proved that institutional Christianity had indeed become Rome's successor rather than Christ's servant. The Renaissance, conventionally understood as cultural rebirth, represented for Weil a dubious achievement at best. While it recovered Greek art and philosophy, it often absorbed the least spiritually valuable elements: Platonic claims to comprehensive knowledge, Roman celebration of power, loss of tragic wisdom about necessity. The modern worldview emerging from the Renaissance combined the worst elements of Greek rationalism, certainty about human understanding, and Roman imperialism, use of power for domination, while abandoning best elements of each tradition: Greek wisdom about limits, Roman genius for legal order. Modern science inherits both Greek insight into mathematical order and Roman drive for power over nature. Science's capacity to discover genuine truths about physical reality reflects Greek genius for discerning necessity's patterns. But science's application through technology often serves the Roman project of dominating nature and other peoples, rather than enabling wise response to necessity. The question for modernity is whether science can be redirected toward wisdom rather than mere power, toward understanding necessity rather than seeking to overcome all constraints. Industrial capitalism represents Rome's final victory in Weil's analysis. The reduction of workers to interchangeable parts, the unlimited expansion of production, the subjection of human life to economic mechanisms, all exemplify Roman orientation toward power and domination. Modern economic systems serve no human purpose but simply expand according to their own logic, exactly as Rome expanded through conquest for its own sake. Workers under capitalism experience the same spiritual destruction as conquered peoples under the Roman Empire: reduction to things, loss of meaningful connection to tradition and community. The cultural task Weil identified is recovering Greek and gospel insights, while refusing Rome's corruption of both traditions. This requires distinguishing authentic spirituality from its institutional betrayals, genuine wisdom from corrupted philosophy, truthful vision of necessity from ideologies that justify domination. It means learning again to attend to beauty and suffering without false consolation or self-deception. It demands creating forms of work, community, and thought that honor human dignity rather than serving mechanisms of force. Contemporary culture faces choices between competing visions Weil's analysis illuminates. Will technology serve wisdom or merely power? Will economic life honor human needs or reduce persons to productive units? Will political systems protect dignity or merely aggregate power? Will intellectual life pursue truth or merely serve institutional interests? Will art reveal beauty or merely entertain? These questions recapitulate the ancient choice between Greek wisdom and Roman domination, between gospel love and imperial force. Weil's historical vision provides resources for diagnosing contemporary crises and imagining alternatives. Part 9: Mathematics, Science, and the Nature of Necessity. Weil's engagement with mathematics and natural science, influenced by her brother's mathematical genius and her own rigorous training, produced insights that distinguish her from most modern philosophers. She understood that mathematics reveals something essential about the relationship between mind and reality, that scientific inquiry exemplifies attention in its purest form, and that necessity, the realm of mathematical and physical law, provides the framework within which human freedom must operate. Her philosophy of science integrates technical understanding with spiritual insight in ways that remain rare and valuable. Mathematics held special significance for Weil because it demonstrates how human thought can achieve necessary and universal truth. A geometric proof once discovered holds for all minds capable of understanding it. Mathematical truths are neither arbitrary conventions nor empirical generalizations, but necessities that thought recognizes rather than creates. This shows that human reason can grasp aspects of reality's structure, that mind and world share common patterns making knowledge possible. Mathematics thus refutes pure skepticism, while avoiding the false claim that mind creates reality. The relationship between mathematical thinking and spiritual discipline became clear to Weil through her own practice of both. Solving a difficult mathematical problem requires the same quality of attention as prayer or moral action. Suspension of wishful thinking, patient waiting for understanding, acceptance of necessity rather than imposition of will. When we cannot solve a problem through clever tricks or forced reasoning but must simply look until we see the answer, we practice the fundamental spiritual discipline of waiting attentively for truth to reveal itself. Geometry particularly exemplified for Weil the proper relationship between mind and necessity. Geometric reasoning proceeds by recognizing necessary relationships between spatial forms, relationships we discover rather than invent. The theorem that a triangle's angles sum to 180 degrees is not a human creation, but a necessity embedded in Euclidean space's structure. Yet human minds can grasp this necessity through patient attention to spatial relationships, showing that we are capable of rising above particular circumstances to apprehend universal truths. Greek mathematics, in Weil's analysis, represented humanity's greatest intellectual achievement prior to gospel revelation. The Pythagoreans and Plato understood that mathematics reveals the cosmos's rational order, that number and proportion govern not just human calculation, but reality itself. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers built on this insight when they applied mathematics to physical phenomena, enabling the scientific revolution. But modernity often forgets the spiritual significance of mathematics, treating it as merely a useful tool rather than a window into reality's structure. The relationship between mathematics and physical science reveals both the power and limits of human knowledge. Science succeeds by discovering mathematical patterns in natural phenomena, laws of motion, chemical equations, evolutionary principles. These patterns exhibit the same necessity as pure mathematics, showing that material reality operates according to rational principles accessible to thought. This enables genuine knowledge and practical application. Yet scientific knowledge remains limited to phenomena we can observe and measure, leaving ultimate questions about existence, meaning, and value beyond scientific methods' reach. Weil's critique of contemporary science focused on its tendency toward instrumental thinking that forgets science's original purpose. Science should serve human wisdom by revealing necessity's patterns and enabling appropriate response to material conditions. Instead, modern science increasingly serves technological domination, economic exploitation, and military violence. The same knowledge that could help humans live wisely within natural constraints gets deployed to overcome constraints through force, to manipulate nature for profit, to create weapons of unprecedented destructive power. This corruption parallels Rome's transformation of Greek wisdom into instruments of imperial domination. The concept of necessity connects Weil's philosophy of mathematics to her broader metaphysics and ethics. Necessity names the realm of mechanical causation, mathematical truth, and physical law, everything that simply is and cannot be otherwise. Human freedom must operate within necessity's constraints. We cannot will away gravity, cannot make mathematical falsehoods true, cannot simply impose our desires on material reality. Wisdom begins with accepting necessity, learning its patterns, and finding freedom through intelligent response rather than futile resistance. Yet necessity is not absolute. The realm of grace transcends necessity without contradicting it, operating through different principles. A mathematical proof exhibits necessity. Given its premises, its conclusion follows inevitably. But the insight that discovers the proof comes as grace, a sudden illumination that cannot be forced or predicted. Similarly, moral action operates within necessity's constraints. We must work with materials, circumstances, and human nature as they are. But the love that motivates moral action transcends necessity, operating through attention and decreation that open space for supernatural influence. The relationship between order and chaos in natural phenomena illuminates deeper questions about creation and divine action. Physical law exhibits order, reliable, predictable patterns that science discovers and mathematics describes. Yet within this order, spontaneous emergence of new forms occurs. Evolution produces unprecedented organisms, chemical processes generate complex structures. Consciousness arises from material substrate. This suggests that creation involves not just imposed order, but ongoing emergence of novelty within necessity's framework, with divine creativity working through natural processes rather than interrupting them. Weil's technological critique emerges from understanding technology as applied science directed toward domination rather than wisdom. Technology multiplies human power without increasing wisdom about power's proper use. It enables destruction of nature's balance, exploitation of workers, creation of artificial needs, and disconnection from reality's constraints. The automobile, the factory assembly line, modern weapons, all exemplify how technical capacity, without spiritual orientation, produces degradation rather than genuine progress. This does not make technology inherently evil, but it does mean technology requires subordination to wisdom rather than autonomy. The ecological implications of Weil's thought, though not explicitly developed in her writings, follow directly from her analysis of necessity and her critique of domination. Environmental destruction results from refusing to accept necessity's constraints, from treating nature as mere resource for human exploitation, rather than as order-demanding, respectful attention. Sustainable human life requires learning nature's patterns, accepting limits, and finding freedom through intelligent adaptation, rather than forceful conquest. This wisdom, present in many traditional cultures, must be recovered if technological civilization is to avoid catastrophic destruction. Contemporary science faces the choice Weil's analysis illuminates: serve wisdom or serve power. Will genetic engineering enable healing or produce new forms of exploitation? Will artificial intelligence enhance human understanding or replace human agency? Will space exploration express wonder and scientific curiosity or extend imperial domination beyond Earth? These questions require not just technical answers, but wisdom about proper human relationship to knowledge and power. Weil's vision of science as a school for attention rather than an instrument of domination provides essential perspective on these urgent contemporary questions. Part 10. Christianity, Judaism, and Religious Truth. Weil's relationship to religious traditions, particularly Christianity and Judaism, represents one of the most controversial and illuminating aspects of her thought. She was drawn powerfully to Christ and Christian mysticism while remaining critical of institutional Christianity and refusing baptism until shortly before death. She was born Jewish, but rejected Jewish particularity while drawing deeply on the Hebrew Bible. Her position defies easy categorization. Neither orthodox believer nor secular humanist, neither inside nor outside religious communities, she sought universal, spiritual truth while honoring particular traditions. The love of Christ stands at the center of Weil's mature spirituality, despite her complex relationship to Christianity. She experienced Christ's presence directly on several occasions and understood Christianity as the fullest revelation of divine love. The cross particularly exemplified divine solidarity with afflicted humanity and decreation as path to resurrection. Christ's teaching about loving enemies, serving the least, and renouncing domination represented a perfect expression of spiritual truth. For Weil, Christ was not merely a moral teacher or religious founder, but the presence of God in human form, suffering affliction to transform suffering's meaning. Yet Weil severely criticized historical Christianity for betraying Christ's teaching and example. The Church's alliance with Roman power, its justification of violence and oppression, its intolerance of other traditions, its emphasis on institutional authority rather than personal transformation, all represented fundamental corruption. She observed that official Christian doctrine about divine omnipotence contradicted gospel revelation of divine kenosis and self-limitation. The claim that Christianity held monopoly on truth contradicted Christ's teaching about seeking truth wherever it appears. These corruptions made Weil hesitant to identify fully with institutional Christianity, despite her devotion to Christ himself. The question of baptism troubled Weil's final years. She desired sacramental union with Christ, but could not honestly affirm all church teachings or ignore Christianity's historical sins. She feared that joining the church might compromise her intellectual honesty or imply acceptance of exclusivist claims she rejected. Yet she also recognized that standing outside all communities represented a form of spiritual pride and isolation. Her eventual baptism shortly before death suggests she resolved these tensions, though exactly how remains unclear. Perhaps she simply accepted that perfect consistency is impossible for finite beings. That genuine participation requires accepting community despite its imperfections. The problem of religious language troubled Weil as it troubles all serious religious thinkers. Traditional theological terms, God, soul, salvation, grace, carry historical baggage that often obscures rather than illuminates truth. Yet abandoning religious language entirely risks losing access to wisdom embedded in spiritual traditions. Weil's solution was using traditional terms while reinterpreting them through philosophical analysis and personal experience, always testing language against lived reality rather than accepting formulations on authority. This approach makes her writing difficult, but rewards careful reading with precision, unavailable in merely conventional religious discourse. Prayer, sacraments, and religious practices possess value, according to Weil, only insofar as they train attention and enable decreation. A practice that increases spiritual pride or provides false comfort has negative spiritual value despite its religious pedigree. A practice that genuinely opens the soul to truth and weakens ego's grip has positive value regardless of its theological justification. This pragmatic, even ruthless criterion allows Weil to value certain traditional practices while rejecting others, to draw from multiple traditions without eclecticism, to maintain spiritual discipline without religious conventionality. The Church as mystical body of Christ represents for Weil an ideal that historical churches approximate imperfectly at best. The true Church consists of all who genuinely love truth and neighbour, regardless of formal religious affiliation. This invisible Church includes faithful Christians, devout Jews, honest atheists, Buddhist monks, anyone whose life exhibits authentic spiritual orientation. Visible churches have value primarily as they facilitate participation in this universal, spiritual community, and become obstacles when they claim exclusive authority or draw boundaries that exclude genuine seekers. Contemporary religious pluralism faces precisely the questions Weil confronted. How can particular traditions maintain distinctive identity while recognizing truth in other traditions? How can genuine spiritual commitment avoid dogmatic exclusivism? How can interfaith dialogue honor differences while seeking common ground? How can religious communities serve spiritual development without becoming tribal identities that divide humanity? Weil's position, honoring multiple traditions while insisting on universal truth, participating in community while maintaining critical independence, suggests one possible response to these urgent, contemporary questions. Weil's interpretation of Christianity emphasized its continuity with other spiritual traditions rather than its uniqueness. She found authentic Christianity prefigured in Plato, in Greek tragedy, in Egyptian mysteries, in Taoist and Hindu wisdom. The Logos that became incarnate in Christ had been active throughout human history, inspiring genuine insights in multiple cultures and traditions. This inclusive vision made Weil unorthodox from traditional Christian perspective, but it reflected her conviction that divine love reaches all who genuinely seek truth, regardless of cultural or historical accidents. The relationship between Christianity and Judaism presented particularly difficult questions. Weil was born into a secular Jewish family, but never identified strongly with Jewish tradition. She criticized what she saw as the Hebrew Bible's portrayal of divine violence and Jewish particularism's claim to special covenant. These criticisms, expressed with shocking harshness, have led some to accuse her of Jewish self-hatred or worse. Yet she also drew extensively on Hebrew prophets and wisdom literature, recognizing in them profound spiritual insight. Her position seems less anti-Jewish than anti-particularist, rejecting all exclusive religious claims while honoring universal, spiritual truth wherever it appears. The problem of religious particularity versus universality cannot be easily resolved, and Weil's position remains controversial. Traditional religious believers emphasize distinctive revelation, particular covenant, specific community as essential to faith. Without particularity, they argue, religion dissolves into vague spirituality, lacking commitment or content. Weil responded that genuine spirituality transcends particular forms while working through them, that divine truth cannot be monopolized by any tradition, that love of truth requires rejecting tribal loyalty when it contradicts universal moral principles. This universalism risks abstracting spirituality from lived community, but also challenges religious tribalism that divides humanity. Mystical experience provided Weil with personal confirmation of supernatural reality that philosophy alone could not provide. Her encounters with Christ were not vague feelings, but specific experiences of presence that transformed her understanding. Yet she insisted that authentic mysticism must be tested by its moral fruits, rather than simply accepted based on subjective certainty. Mystical experiences that increase love, attention, and moral clarity come from divine source. Those that increase pride, exclusivism, or escape from reality's demands come from illusory sources. This pragmatic criterion prevents mysticism from becoming self-indulgent fantasy while honoring genuine supernatural encounters. Part 11. Politics, Revolution, and Social Justice. Weil's political philosophy emerged from her unusual combination of philosophical rigor, personal experience of labor and oppression, and refusal to subordinate truth to ideological consistency. She participated actively in workers' movements, supported revolutionary causes, and fought briefly in the Spanish Civil War. Yet she also criticized revolutionary movements for reproducing the very oppression they claimed to fight, for substituting one tyranny for another, for sacrificing individuals to abstract historical processes. Her political thought maintains extraordinary honesty about revolutionary failure while never abandoning commitment to justice. The critique of revolutionary totalitarianism distinguished Weil from most left intellectuals of her generation. While others excused Soviet brutality as necessary for historical progress, or denied the purges and famine, Weil recognized early that Soviet communism represented a new form of oppression rather than liberation. Her analysis identified the fundamental problem. Revolutionary movements that seize state power inevitably reproduce hierarchical domination because they have not transformed the underlying organization of labor and social relations. Changing who owns factories matters little if workers remain subordinated to managers, if production remains fragmented and meaningless, if force rather than persuasion governs social coordination. Marx's fundamental error, according to Weil, was believing that historical forces inevitably drive toward revolution, and that seizing the means of production would automatically liberate workers. This determinism encouraged passivity disguised as revolutionary activism, waiting for contradictions to mature rather than creating conditions for genuine freedom. Moreover, Marx's analysis focused too exclusively on ownership, while ignoring how labor itself was organized. Even if workers collectively owned factories, if production remained organized according to Taylorist principles that fragmented tasks and eliminated thought from work, oppression would continue under different names. The Spanish Civil War provided Weil with direct experience of revolutionary violence and self-deception. She volunteered for an anarchist militia in 1936, motivated by solidarity with workers and opposition to fascism. But she witnessed summary executions, mindless destruction, and the reproduction of authoritarian patterns among supposed revolutionaries. The experience convinced her that violence corrupts even just causes, that revolutionary movements systematically lie about their own actions, that warfare destroys the moral clarity required for genuine political transformation. She left Spain disillusioned but not cynical, maintaining commitment to justice while rejecting revolutionary romanticism. Pacifism versus necessary violence remained an unresolved tension in Weil's political thought. Her natural inclination toward absolute pacifism confronted the reality that some evils, Nazi conquest, totalitarian tyranny, might justify violent resistance as the lesser evil. Yet she insisted that even necessary violence corrupts, and that those who fight must acknowledge their own participation in evil rather than claiming righteousness. The challenge is maintaining moral clarity while acting in morally compromised situations, refusing both pure pacifism that ignores genuine dilemmas and militarism that glorifies violence as heroic or redemptive. Trade unions and workers' organizations represented for Weil both promise and disappointment. They could enable genuine worker solidarity, collective resistance to exploitation, and development of working-class culture and consciousness. But they also frequently became bureaucratic institutions serving their own interests rather than workers' needs, collaborating with management and state power, or subordinating members to organizational discipline that reproduced the very hierarchies workers supposedly fought. The question was whether worker organizations could maintain authentic grassroots democracy and serve genuine liberation, rather than becoming new mechanisms of control. The ideal of workers' control appeared throughout Weil's political writings as the fundamental goal of just social organization. Workers should collectively manage production, deciding what to produce, how to organize labor, and how to distribute the fruits of collective effort. This requires not just formal ownership, but actual understanding of production processes, development of technical and organizational skills, and creation of democratic procedures that enable genuine participation. Such transformation cannot be imposed from above by revolutionary vanguard, but must emerge from workers' own education and organization. Education for political consciousness presented crucial challenges. Workers exhausted by industrial labor, deprived of leisure and cultural resources, kept ignorant of technical knowledge underlying production. Such workers cannot suddenly govern themselves effectively after revolution. Genuine liberation requires long preparation through education that develops intellectual capacities, through reorganization of work that preserves space for thought, through cultural renewal that roots individuals in traditions of meaning and value. Revolutionary movements that promise immediate transformation through seizure of power inevitably disappoint because they ignore these prerequisites. The relationship between means and ends in politics became central to Weil's critique of consequentialist revolutionary ethics. Movements that justify any means by appeal to revolutionary ends inevitably corrupt their own purposes. Violence creates habits of violence. Lying produces cultures of deception. Hierarchical organization of revolutionary movements prepares only for hierarchical society after revolution. The means we employ shape the ends we achieve far more than declared intentions or theoretical programs. This insight, though not new, deserved emphasis against revolutionary movements that systematically violated it. Nationalism and internationalism both attracted Weil's criticism for opposite distortions. Nationalism makes a particular nation into an idol, claiming absolute loyalty and justifying any atrocity committed in its name. But abstract internationalism that denies the value of particular cultures and traditions produces uprootedness and makes people vulnerable to totalitarian movements offering false community. The proper balance is recognizing the value of rooted participation in particular traditions while refusing tribal loyalty that denies common humanity. We need both roots in particular communities and recognition of universal human dignity transcending all particular identities. Colonial oppression represented for Weil one of history's greatest crimes, comparable to slavery in its spiritual destruction of both colonized and colonizers. European powers destroyed indigenous cultures, exploited labor and resources, and justified everything through racist ideologies of civilizing missions. The colonized suffered not just economic exploitation, but cultural annihilation that left them rootless and degraded. Meanwhile, colonizers were corrupted through habituation to domination, through accepting racism as natural hierarchy, through constructing identities based on presumed superiority. Decolonization would require not just political independence but cultural and spiritual renewal that might take generations. The question of political obligation, when to obey authority and when to resist, required nuanced judgment, Weil struggled to articulate systematically. Generally, established legal order deserves respect because it provides a framework for peaceful coordination and protects against chaos and violence. Yet obedience to unjust law participates in injustice, and some situations demand civil disobedience or even revolutionary resistance. The criterion must be whether a regime protects conditions necessary for human dignity and spiritual development. Regimes that systematically produce affliction, that reduce persons to things, that make genuine moral life impossible. Such regimes forfeit any claim to legitimate authority. Contemporary politics faces many questions Weil's analysis illuminates. How can economic justice be pursued without reproducing bureaucratic oppression? How can nations maintain sovereignty while participating in global cooperation? How can revolutionary energy be channeled toward genuine transformation rather than mere power transfer? How can workers gain meaningful control over production in complex technological systems? How can political movements maintain moral integrity while operating in morally compromised circumstances? Weil's thought provides not simple answers, but frameworks for addressing these enduring challenges with realism and moral clarity. Part 12. Reading, Writing, and the Life of the Mind. Weil's approach to texts and intellectual life exemplifies her distinctive philosophical method. She read classical philosophy, religious scriptures, and literary works not as historical documents or aesthetic objects, but as living sources of truth requiring active engagement. Her interpretations were often unconventional, sometimes willful, but always aimed at extracting maximum spiritual and philosophical insight. This engaged reading practice reflects her conviction that genuine thinking requires personal transformation rather than mere acquisition of information or scholarly expertise. The method of reading Weil practiced and taught emphasized slow, careful attention to every word and phrase. Reading well requires suspending one's preconceptions, resisting the urge to impose familiar interpretations, waiting patiently for the text to reveal its meaning. This discipline parallels the attention required in mathematics, in moral response, and in prayer. A difficult philosophical passage that resists easy understanding provides opportunity for developing the capacity to sustain attention without forcing comprehension. The struggle to understand genuinely difficult texts trains precisely the spiritual capacity most needed for all aspects of life. Greek texts held a special place in Weil's intellectual life: Homer, the tragedians, Plato, the pre-Socratics. She learned ancient Greek specifically to read these works in their original language, convinced that translation inevitably obscures nuances essential to their meaning. Her interpretations emphasized spiritual and ethical dimensions that classical scholarship often missed through excessive focus on philological detail or historical context. She read Plato not as a systematic metaphysician, but as a spiritual guide pointing toward the good beyond all conceptual formulation. She read Homer not as a primitive epic, but as profound meditation on force and necessity. The Gospels received similarly engaged reading. Weil approached them as sacred texts, demanding not just intellectual analysis, but personal response and transformation. She attended especially to Jesus' most difficult teachings: love of enemies, renunciation of all possessions, taking no thought for tomorrow. These impossible demands reveal the supernatural character of Christian ethics. They cannot be fulfilled through natural human capacity, but only through grace enabling decreation. Reading the Gospels properly means letting them challenge and transform us, rather than interpreting them to conform to our existing values and capabilities. The practice of translation exemplified for Weil the discipline of attention in its purest form. Translating requires complete respect for the original text, absolute honesty about one's own understanding, and willingness to struggle with passages that resist comprehension. The translator cannot impose meaning, but must wait for understanding to emerge, must test multiple possibilities, must accept that some nuances will remain untranslatable. This humility before the text, this patience with difficulty, this refusal to simplify, all exemplify the spiritual discipline that genuine intellectual work requires. Writing for Weil served not primarily to communicate already formed thoughts, but to discover truth through the process of articulation. Her notebooks and essays show her thinking aloud, testing ideas, following implications, encountering contradictions, and pushing toward clarity. She wrote not for academic audiences or popular readership, but to understand more deeply, to see more clearly, to articulate insights that first appeared vaguely. This makes her writing sometimes difficult and fragmentary, but also uniquely honest and alive with genuine intellectual struggle. The fragmentary character of Weil's writings reflects both biographical accident — her early death prevented systematic completion — and philosophical principle. She distrusted comprehensive systems that claim to explain everything, preferring aphoristic wisdom that honors the complexity and mystery of existence. Single sentences or brief paragraphs sometimes contain insights that would be diluted through elaboration. The fragment allows maximal concentration of meaning, demands active engagement from readers, and resists the false closure that systematic philosophy imposes on questions that admit no final answers. Poetry held special significance for Weil because it uses language at maximum intensity and concentration. A great poem says in few words what prose requires many pages to approximate. The poet's gift is finding the exact words that embody rather than merely describe experience, that create rather than report meaning. Weil particularly valued poets who achieved impersonal beauty, George Herbert's religious poems, certain French medieval lyrics. where the personality of the poet becomes transparent to universal truth rather than imposing individual perspective. The relationship between thinking and living gave Weil's intellectual work its distinctive character. She insisted that philosophy that remains merely theoretical, that does not transform how one lives, is not genuine philosophy but only intellectual game-playing. True philosophical understanding changes us. It makes impossible actions that ignorance permits. It creates obligations previously unrecognized. It enables perceptions previously impossible. This integration of thought and life meant that Weil's philosophical development always involved personal transformation, that her ideas were tested through lived experience rather than just logical coherence. The notebooks Weil kept throughout her adult life reveal her intellectual method in detail. She recorded insights, quotations, questions, and arguments in no systematic order, allowing ideas to juxtapose and interact organically. These notebooks show her reading across multiple traditions: Greek philosophy, Christian mysticism, Sanskrit texts, scientific works, seeking convergent insights that confirm universal truths. They also show her returning repeatedly to certain themes and questions, deepening understanding through sustained engagement, rather than achieving quick resolution and moving on. The problem of communicating spiritual truth in secular culture challenged Weil as it challenges all religious thinkers in modernity. Traditional religious language has become inaccessible to many educated people who associate it with superstition or institutional corruption. Yet secular philosophical vocabulary lacks resources for discussing supernatural reality, grace, and spiritual transformation. Weil's solution was creating hybrid vocabulary that uses philosophical precision to clarify religious insight while using religious language to indicate realities that philosophy alone cannot capture. This strategy creates difficulties but avoids both religious obscurantism and secular reductionism. Contemporary intellectual life faces questions Weil's example illuminates. Can universities cultivate genuine thinking or only professional expertise? Can reading remain transformative practice, or must it become mere information extraction? Can writing serve truth, or only career advancement? Can intellectual work maintain connection to moral and spiritual development, or must it remain a technical specialty divorced from questions of how to live? Weil's life and work testify that authentic intellectual life remains possible but requires resisting powerful institutional and cultural forces that reduce thinking to instrumental activity. Part 13. Waiting, Desire, and the Spiritual Journey. The concept of waiting stands alongside attention and affliction as fundamental to Weil's spiritual vision. Waiting is not mere passivity or empty time-killing, but active, attentive orientation toward what we cannot possess or control. We wait for understanding that cannot be forced, for grace that cannot be earned, for truth that reveals itself in its own time. This waiting requires the most difficult of spiritual disciplines, remaining open and attentive while accepting that we cannot determine when or how what we seek will come. Modern culture, with its emphasis on efficiency, control, and instant gratification, systematically undermines the capacity for genuine waiting. The relationship between desire and waiting reveals a paradox at the heart of spiritual life. We must desire intensely, desire truth, desire goodness, desire God, or we will not sustain the effort required for spiritual development. Yet we must also not grasp at the objects of desire, not try to possess or control them, not demand that they conform to our expectations. This combination of maximum intensity and complete passivity seems impossible, yet it describes the attitude necessary for genuine spiritual progress. We must want nothing more than truth, while simultaneously relinquishing all demands about how truth should appear. We'll distinguish several forms of waiting that spiritual life requires. Intellectual waiting accepts that understanding cannot be forced and that some problems require long periods of confusion before clarity emerges. The student struggling with a difficult text or problem must resist the temptation to pretend understanding or to settle for superficial solutions. This patience with intellectual difficulty develops the capacity to sustain attention without immediate reward, preparing the soul for moral and spiritual waiting that demands even greater discipline. Moral waiting involves suspending judgment in situations where proper action is unclear. Sometimes we face genuine dilemmas where competing obligations conflict and no choice seems entirely right. The temptation is to act precipitously, to escape uncomfortable uncertainty through decisive action, even if that action is wrong. But wisdom sometimes requires waiting, maintaining attention to the situation, gathering more understanding, allowing time for clarity to emerge. This waiting is not indecision or cowardice, but rather the courage to remain open to truth despite discomfort. Spiritual waiting, waiting for God, represents the supreme form of this discipline. God cannot be manipulated through ritual or compelled through prayer. We cannot earn grace through moral achievement or mystical practice. We can only create space for divine presence through decreation and then wait. This waiting may last lifetimes without apparent result. Yet the waiting itself constitutes the relationship with God, since authentic relationship requires respecting the other's freedom rather than demanding response. We prove our love precisely by waiting without resentment or demand. The concept of implicit love of God helps explain how waiting relates to action. We cannot love God directly because God infinitely exceeds human comprehension. But we can love truth, beauty, and suffering persons, finite realities that point beyond themselves toward divine reality. When we wait patiently for understanding, attend carefully to beauty, or serve afflicted neighbors, we implicitly love God without necessarily recognizing it. This implicit love may be more authentic than explicit religious devotion that claims to love God directly but manifests as spiritual pride or escape from reality's demands. Desire plays a complex role in Weil's spirituality. Natural desire seeks to possess its objects, to incorporate them into the self, to use them for self-satisfaction. This form of desire, even when directed toward apparently spiritual objects, remains fundamentally egoistic. True spiritual desire differs completely. It seeks not to possess, but to honor reality as it is. Not to incorporate, but to transcend self through attention to what lies beyond. Converting natural desire into spiritual desire requires the transformation that decreation accomplishes, enabling us to want things for their own sake rather than as means to self-satisfaction. The experience of absence, of God, of truth, of meaning, tests spiritual waiting most severely. When long effort produces no apparent result, when prayer meets only silence, when goodness seems unrewarded and evil triumphant, the temptation is abandoning spiritual effort as futile. Yet Weil insisted that apparent absence may be the deepest form of divine presence. God's hiddenness respects human freedom and prevents spiritual relationships from becoming mere transactions. Learning to love despite absence, to maintain attention despite apparent futility, to keep waiting when nothing seems to justify continued waiting. This represents the ultimate spiritual achievement. The distinction between patience and resignation clarifies the active character of waiting. Resignation accepts circumstances passively without maintaining hope or effort. Patience actively sustains attention and desire while accepting that timing and means lie beyond our control. The patient person continues making effort, continues hoping, continues attending, but without demanding immediate results or specific outcomes. This combination of activity and passivity, of sustained effort and acceptance of limits, characterizes authentic spiritual discipline. Suffering's relationship to waiting reveals why affliction proves so spiritually dangerous. Extreme suffering makes waiting nearly impossible because it crushes the capacity for attention and hope. The afflicted person cannot sustain the active passivity that genuine waiting requires, but rather collapses into either desperate grasping or complete despair. This explains why affliction threatens spiritual life so fundamentally, not just because it causes pain, but because it destroys the psychological conditions necessary for spiritual development. Only grace can enable waiting during affliction, and such grace represents supernatural intervention beyond natural human capacity. The contemporary erosion of capacity for waiting manifests in countless ways. Digital technology provides instant gratification that trains impatience, rather than developing the ability to sustain attention without immediate reward. Economic systems demand constant productivity that leaves no space for contemplative waiting. Educational institutions emphasize rapid information acquisition over slow, deep understanding. Entertainment media offer constant stimulation that makes silence and stillness unbearable. Recovering capacity for genuine waiting may be among the most urgent spiritual tasks facing contemporary persons. Weil's own life exemplified the discipline of waiting she described. She waited years for a mystical experience that came unexpectedly. She waited for understanding of difficult texts through patient, repeated reading. She waited for proper political action during periods when no good options existed. She waited for baptism while working through theological and institutional doubts. Most poignantly, she waited for fuller spiritual development that death prevented. Yet this waiting was never passive resignation, but rather intense, attentive orientation toward truth that shaped every aspect of her existence. Part 14. Beauty, Art, and the Order of the World. Beauty for Weil is not mere aesthetic pleasure or subjective preference, but a fundamental category revealing something essential about reality's structure. Beautiful things, whether natural phenomena like stars and trees or human creations like music and architecture, exhibit an order and harmony that points beyond themselves toward the ultimate order underlying existence. This makes beauty a form of revelation, a sensory manifestation of otherwise inaccessible truth. Understanding beauty's nature and significance provides crucial insight into Weil's comprehensive worldview. The beauty of the world, nature's splendor, holds a special place in Weil's philosophy because it seems gratuitous, given freely without purpose or demand. Stars shine whether or not humans observe them. Flowers bloom in deserts where no one will see their colors. Birdsong fills forests without human audience. This generosity of natural beauty mirrors divine generosity and provides indirect access to God for those incapable of or not yet ready for explicit religious faith. The atheist who loves mountains or the ocean implicitly loves God, since the beauty of the world reflects divine beauty, whether or not the lover recognizes the source. Mathematical order underlying physical reality connects beauty to necessity and to understanding. When scientists discover that planetary orbits follow elliptical paths, or that crystals exhibit geometric symmetry, they discover both necessity and beauty. The equations describing physical phenomena possess elegance that scientists recognize as indicating truth. This aesthetic dimension of scientific discovery suggests that beauty is not an arbitrary human response, but genuine perception of reality's structure. The universe exhibits intelligible order that both mind and senses can apprehend as beautiful. The relationship between beauty and necessity resolves in the concept of order. Beauty is necessity made perceptible, constraint and limit revealed as harmony rather than mere restriction. A fugue demonstrates this perfectly. The strict rules of counterpoint create constraints that seem impossibly limiting. Yet Bach transforms these constraints into beauty of mathematical precision combined with emotional power. Similarly, the physical necessities governing matter and energy produce the ordered cosmos we experience as beautiful. Necessity and freedom, constraint and creativity are not opposites, but complementary aspects of cosmic order. Greek art and architecture exemplified for Weil the achievement of beauty through perfect proportion and restraint. The Parthenon exhibits mathematical harmony in its dimensions, its columns subtly curved to correct optical distortion, every element proportioned according to geometric principles. This beauty results not from arbitrary aesthetic choice, but from discovery of objective proportion that satisfies both reason and sense. Medieval Romanesque architecture achieved similar perfection through different principles, creating spaces that lift the soul toward transcendence through mass, rhythm, and symbolic geometry. The decline of authentic beauty in modern culture follows from loss of connection to tradition, craft, and the discipline of attending to proportion and necessity. Modern art often pursues novelty or self-expression, rather than discovering order already present in materials and forms. Architecture emphasizes function or novelty rather than proportion and harmony. The result is environments that fail to nourish the soul, that provide stimulation without beauty, that embody power or efficiency without grace. This aesthetic impoverishment reflects and reinforces the broader spiritual crisis of modernity. Sacred art, icons, Gregorian chant, Gothic cathedrals serve special function by directing attention explicitly toward divine reality. Unlike secular art that might implicitly reveal the sacred, religious art intentionally creates openings toward transcendence. The Byzantine icon employs a reverse perspective that places the viewer before divine presence, rather than offering an illusory window onto earthly scene. Plainchant's mathematical structure and deliberate impersonality enable words to convey sacred meaning without individual interpretation imposing itself. Gothic space uses light and vertical emphasis to create architecture of transcendence that lifts consciousness beyond earthly concerns. The relationship between beauty and affliction presents one of existence's most painful contrasts. Beauty commands attention without force, gives itself freely, elevates consciousness. Affliction compels attention through suffering, crushes the soul, degrades consciousness. Yet both reveal truth about existence. Beauty showing the divine order underlying reality, affliction showing the blind necessity that crushes everything in its path. Wisdom requires attending to both, refusing to escape affliction through false consolation while also refusing to deny beauty through cynicism born of suffering. Poetry achieves beauty through language used at maximum intensity and precision. A great poem says what prose cannot say, reveals what ordinary language obscures, creates rather than merely describes experience. Will particularly valued poetry that achieves impersonal beauty, where the poet becomes transparent to universal truth rather than imposing personal perspective. George Herbert's religious lyrics exemplify this impersonality, using simple language and traditional forms to express spiritual truths that transcend individual experience while remaining absolutely concrete and particular. Music's unique relationship to time and mathematics makes it perhaps the purest form of beauty accessible to human senses. Musical order unfolds temporally according to mathematical relationships, intervals, rhythms, harmonic progressions that create structure in time analogous to geometry's structure in space. Great music transforms temporal flow from mere succession of moments into meaningful patterns, redeeming time through imposing order. This redemptive quality of musical beauty provides an image of how grace operates, transforming chaos into order, darkness into light, suffering into meaning. The education of taste requires long apprenticeship and cultural transmission that modern society often fails to provide. Recognizing genuine beauty, distinguishing it from mere prettiness, sentimentality, or fashionable novelty, demands developed capacity for attention and understanding of proportion, harmony, and traditional forms. Without such education, people remain vulnerable to kitsch and commercialized pseudo-beauty that manipulates emotion without revealing truth. Cultural institutions should preserve and transmit standards enabling authentic aesthetic judgment, but often they abandon this responsibility in favor of pluralistic acceptance of all aesthetic claims as equally valid. Contemporary culture's aesthetic crisis reflects its broader spiritual impoverishment. When buildings are designed purely functionally without regard for proportion and beauty, when music degenerates into mere entertainment or sound effect, when poetry abandons formal discipline for self-expression, when visual arts reject beauty as bourgeois or sentimental, these aesthetic failures both reflect and cause the loss of capacity for attention, for recognizing order, for perceiving truth. Recovering authentic beauty requires recovering the spiritual discipline that both enables its creation and allows its recognition. Weil's aesthetics challenges both traditional philosophical accounts that reduce beauty to subjective pleasure and contemporary relativism that denies objective aesthetic standards. Beauty is neither mere feeling nor arbitrary social construction, but genuine perception of order inherent in reality's structure. This order is mathematical and objective, yet it requires developed capacity for attention and understanding to perceive. The challenge for aesthetic theory is explaining how beauty can be both objective and perceptible only to properly educated sensitivity, both universal and requiring cultural formation to recognize. Part 15. Death, Immortality, and Ultimate Questions. Weil's premature death at age 34 lends poignant significance to her reflections on mortality, immortality, and the ultimate meaning of human existence. She wrote extensively about death as both natural necessity and spiritual opportunity, viewing it neither with morbid fascination nor naive denial, but as fact requiring honest acknowledgement. Her thoughts on immortality avoided both conventional religious assurances and materialist dismissal, seeking understanding grounded in genuine insight rather than wishful thinking or defensive skepticism. The phenomenon of death reveals human vulnerability with perfect clarity. All plans, all achievements, all personal identity eventually dissolves into nothingness. This brute fact challenges all systems of meaning that ignore finitude or pretend that individual existence possesses lasting significance. Yet death also reveals the contingency of ego and the possibility of transcendence. If the self we defend so desperately must inevitably perish, perhaps authentic existence lies not in defending this self, but in surrendering it voluntarily through decreation. Death thus becomes an image of spiritual transformation, rather than merely biological termination. Weil's concept of immortality differed from traditional religious notions of eternal, personal survival. She suggested that what continues is not individual personality, but rather whatever in us has become transparent to eternal truth. The part of us that has undergone decreation, that has abandoned ego in favor of attention to reality, that has loved truth impersonally, this part participates in eternity not as continuing individual existence, but as having entered eternal order beyond temporal succession. This vision makes immortality not an automatic feature of human nature, but spiritual achievement requiring transformation in this life. The relationship between time and eternity preoccupied Weil's metaphysical reflections. Time is the form of necessity, of succession and causation, of change and decay. Eternity is not endless time, but rather a different mode of existence altogether, the realm of mathematical truth, of divine reality, of unchanging order underlying temporal flux. Human existence spans both realms. We live in time, subject to change and death, yet we can apprehend eternal truths through reason and participate in eternity through spiritual transformation. This dual nature makes us uniquely positioned between temporal and eternal, capable of experiencing both necessity and grace. Suffering's relationship to death illuminates affliction's special horror. Affliction is not just the threat of death, but spiritual death occurring during biological life, the destruction of what makes us human while the body continues existing. This makes affliction worse than mere death, since it involves ongoing degradation rather than simple termination. The fear of affliction is more rational than fear of death, because affliction destroys the soul while death merely ends a life that must end anyway. Wisdom requires not fearing death excessively while remaining vigilant against conditions that produce affliction. Weil's own approach to dying exemplified her philosophical convictions. When tuberculosis made recovery difficult, she reportedly refused adequate food, perhaps from solidarity with war victims, perhaps from spiritual motives, perhaps from psychological factors we cannot fully understand. Her death has been interpreted as inadvertent suicide, as natural consequence of illness and wartime conditions, as quasi-martyrdom. Whatever the precise circumstances, she faced death with apparent calmness, continuing intellectual work until the very end, maintaining spiritual discipline despite physical suffering. The question of what happens after death admits no certain answer based on experience or reason alone. Weil acknowledged this uncertainty while refusing both dogmatic assertion and anxious worry. We cannot know with certainty whether consciousness continues, whether justice is fulfilled in afterlife, whether love transcends death. Yet practical reason requires acting as if certain things are true, as if justice ultimately prevails, as if love has lasting meaning, as if spiritual effort is not futile. This practical faith differs from theoretical knowledge, but provides a sufficient basis for living meaningfully despite metaphysical uncertainty. Resurrection, as a spiritual concept rather than merely biological restoration, captured Weil's interpretation of Christian teaching. Resurrection means transformation from self-centered to God-centered existence, from temporal to eternal participation, from gravitational existence bound to necessity to existence liberated through grace. This resurrection can begin during earthly life through decreation and becomes complete through death, when all that remains is what has become eternal through love and attention. Physical resurrection becomes less important than spiritual transformation that makes eternal life possible. The meaning of a human life cannot be measured by its duration or external achievements, but only by its participation in truth, beauty, and goodness. A short life that attends genuinely to reality, that loves without grasping, that accepts necessity while seeking justice. Such a life achieves its purpose regardless of length. Conversely, long life filled with distraction, self-concern, and inattention fails to realize human potential despite many years. Quality of attention and spiritual orientation matter infinitely more than quantity of experiences or accomplishments. Memory's role in immortality suggests one form of continuity beyond death. We live on in others who remember us, whose lives we influenced, whose understanding we shaped. This social immortality is not mere continuation of biological existence, but rather continuation of spiritual influence. Great teachers, artists, and moral exemplars shape countless lives across generations, achieving a kind of eternity through their impact on human culture and consciousness. Yet this social immortality remains finite and contingent, not the eternal participation Weil envisioned as authentic immortality. Contemporary culture's evasion of death through medical technology, through consumer distraction, through therapeutic languages that avoid acknowledging mortality, all this represents spiritual failure in Weil's framework. Honest acknowledgement of finitude is prerequisite for authentic existence. When we deny death, we deny the urgency that should motivate spiritual development, the seriousness with which we should approach moral choices, the gratitude we should feel for beauty and love that cannot last forever. Recovering an honest relationship with mortality represents a crucial task for culture that has made death invisible while becoming obsessed with mere survival. Weil's legacy includes her willingness to confront ultimate questions without false comfort or evasive abstraction. She acknowledged what we cannot know while refusing to pretend that uncertainties don't matter. She honored traditional religious wisdom while insisting on intellectual honesty. She maintained hope for transcendence while accepting necessity's constraints. This combination of philosophical rigor and spiritual openness, of honesty about limits and affirmation of possibilities, characterizes her approach to death and immortality as it characterizes her entire philosophical project.